So I'm looking at the DraftKings slate from last week in the Korean Zombie fight. 100K to first for the main GPP. This is a big one. It was chopped up 25 ways. So everyone of that 100K to first only got $6,540. If you're max entering at $15 a lineup times 150 for $2,200, a 3-to-1 payout is not going to be a long-term profitable strategy for you, especially if this is the only way you can win. So if you're hunting for 3-to-1 payouts, you shouldn't be playing GPPs. So this got me thinking, how do I look at finding an optimal lineup that's also unique in UFC? Uniqueness is huge here. It would have been the difference between 100K and 6K to first, which is easily the difference between profitable and not profitable long term. So I did some analysis on this. Makes you really think about how many lineups are possible. There are a lot of people in the pool, but there's only a certain number of fighters. Everyone must pick 6 fighters, and there's other restrictions on what you can pick, and that makes it so it's very limited in number of viable lineups. So I did some math, or did some programming. So in this slate, there was 22 fighters, and let's first, for this example, assume that we know that the main event is not going to be stacked. You're not going to have both fighters in the main event. That's just not going to work. Stacking usually doesn't pay out anyways. It only does in the main event, but let's assume it doesn't happen this time. Let's assume a viable lineup must have spent over average per player. I mean, if you look at pricing, the pricing on DraftKings usually averages 8,100 for a fight, so the winner is 8,100 plus something, and the favorite underdog is 8,100 minus something. And so it averages around there. 6 of those, you're looking at about 48.6. So let's call that our cheap threshold. Anything below that, I'm not going to consider viable. If something does happen where that you need to spend that little salary where you're getting 4 or 5 underdogs, I don't think that's ever really going to happen, and that's not going to be found by a player. Some non-optimal, someone with the non-nuts is going to win. And then requiring the main event, I think on this card, especially with the high strike rates that you knew going in, like because of 5 rounds, you can pretty safely assume that the main event should have been in your optimal lineup. So if we run with those assumptions, which I think are all pretty safe, I run my analysis. So if you had 24 fighters and you had to pick 6, any 6, theoretically that means there's 74,613 choices. But not all of those are viable. So if I reduce the number viable, well, you should never stack anything other than a main event. That's just nonsense. A 3-round fight on an 11-fight card, there's 0 chance it's going to be optimal on such a card. Maybe if there's like a 7 or 8 fight card, but on a larger card, the loser of a fight who only goes 3 rounds is not going to be in the optimal lineup. So we can throw those out. These are the lineups where salary just says you can't make it. It's over 50,000. 12,000 of those, you can't do that. No main event. So we said that there has to be a main event in your optimal lineup. That's a pretty safe assumption in this card. 10,000 lineups get thrown away there. And choosing 4 or 5 underdogs or 6 underdogs is just too cheap. You're not spending enough money. Why bother looking at those lineups? Throw those out. So it really only leaves you with 5,000 viable lineups. Think about that. There were, in this field, 27,371 lineups were submitted. There's only 5,000 possible lineups that could have theoretically won first place. We're given these assumptions, which I think are very safe. And if we use this viability threshold, how many lineups can we throw out? Well, there's only 22,562 lineups that are viable to win. So if you take that out, 5,000 out of the 27,000, that's roughly paying the rake. So as long as you're making decent lineups that have a shot at winning, long term you should be profitable as long as you're beating average of the rest of the pool of players who are only playing viable lineups. So of these 5,070 lineups, I'm not considering any projections here. If there's a fight that's projected be very low strike rate, no finish. It could be a 40 or 30 points to 0 finish. I'm still going to include that as a viable lineup here. I'm just not even considering projections. Of those, 1,800 weren't used. So that means over 3,000 of the 5,000 lineups that were possible were used. So 60% of all possible winning lineups were used. So you're not having a very good chance of, if you're going to add your next lineup into that, being unique on your own. So then you break it down by price. How much salary? Because that's a typical way that people like to try to get unique in UFC and earn UFC DraftKings. So if you leave some money on the table, now sometimes it doesn't pay out. In this case, the winning lineup used all $50,000. It was the optimal. You couldn't beat it. You had to do it to win. But if you don't have to do it to win, and you find a lineup with less salary usage, you actually have a much higher chance of becoming optimal. So I made this table here, not on the table, printed this out. So here's how to read it. On this card, if you spent all $50,000, there were 6,000 people who did it, 6,000 lineups that spent all $50,000. Of the possible viable combinations, there were 278 viable combinations that used 50,000. Only one of those 278 wasn't used. So that means if you spent $50,000 and you just picked a random one of these lineups, 1 out of 278 chance you would have been unique. And of those 278, only 4 of them were unique already. So really, there's very low chance of being unique if you spend all your money. You have a better chance of winning, of course, but that loses profitability just because you're not going to be unique when you do win, so it's not worth playing. So as you can guess, if you spend less money, the number of lineups that weren't used goes up, and the number of unique lineups that were used goes up. So these are where you really want to be. You want to be unique or picking a lineup that wasn't used. The unique one means there's only one player using it. If you got it, you got a two-way chop. That's not the end of the world. That's fine. Too much more, and you're really starting to cut into your profits. So looking at this, I typically set my threshold around 49.7, where I will start. That's where I can max out my profit or my salary usage, which end up giving me distribution usually between 49,000 and 49.7. That's where I spend most of my money. But I'm interested in trying to figure out where the tipping point is. At what point are you more likely to be unique than not? Just picking a random lineup that spends that salary. Now again, this ignores all projections, ownership projections. Those will combine to make you have a less chance of being unique. Why? Because if you have a good projection, everyone else has the same projections, you're going to find the same mispricings that DraftKings made. And so when you both account for the same mispricings, you're going to land in the same lineups. This is assuming DraftKings priced perfectly. Everyone has the same odds of winning. Every different lineup has the same odds of winning. So if we look at 49.7, there were 2015 entries that used that out of the possible 27,000. So a little under 10% of all lineups were using 49.7 exactly. There were 308 viable lineups, and of the ones that were used 0 or once, 80 lineups. So roughly a fourth of all these lineups, if you put it in, you get duped at most once. It's not that bad, 25% chance, especially considering once you start dropping past 49.7, you really do start dropping your win rate, your chance of banking, just because you're picking up too many underdogs. You're not getting all those high value 9,200, 9,300 favorites who you can get a first round 2 knockdown finish. But what I found interesting is how fast it drops off. And then one more thing worth noting. So this initial analysis was run assuming you could use every fight on the card. Well, sometimes it's pretty obvious that you can just red light, thumbs down, 1 or 2 fights on the card. So say with very high confidence, and this is taking a risk of course, you can say these 2 fights are not going to be in the optimal. Say you have a 9,300 price on a favorite who's just a very low strike rate, very low finish rate. You can be very, very confident that these 2 fights are not going to end up in the optimal, even if the underdog wins. or you just assume the underdog is not going to win. Very rarely that you're going to be wrong. So say you can make that assumption. Let's see how much it does and see if you think it's actually worth it to make that assumption, or rather a wager on it. So if I drop that down from 22 to 18, here's the results I ran earlier. Before, there was 5,000 viable lineups that you had to sift through. Your projections had to take those 5,000 lineups and basically produce 150 lineups and find the optimal. So 150 out of 5,000, 1 in 30. 1/30 chance, if assuming randomly distributed, but your projections should hopefully get you there. Maybe you can get there 1 in 10 and you're profiting because you bank 1 every 10 and you're optimal and you're unique. So assuming your projections get you that far. On this card, run it again. Here. If you threw out 2 fights, I picked 2 at random. I think they're the first 2 fights on the card. Doesn't really matter which you pick. Then the number of viable lineups drops down to 1,000. So you have 150 lineups you can make. You have to get, your 150 has to find the optimal out of 1,000. You get projections, of course. This is assuming random distribution. So if your projections can get that 150 to find the optimal out of 1,000, then you're banking. You're going to win. So what assumptions do I have to make in order to get my search space down this small? So I had to throw out 4 fighters from 2 fights. Oftentimes you can do that. It's the higher level women's MMA a lot of the time where they do high decision rates, lower strike rates. It's more technical fighting, not as much striking and not as high of a risk of a knockout early. That'll happen a lot. You can oftentimes throw out 2 fights from the card. So that's what I did here. The other assumption I made was there's no stacking in the main event. You had to spend over 48,600 and you required the main event. And if you did that, your odds of picking the optimal just randomly, not even considering projections, are like 1 in 6. Think about that. If that's all it takes, it should be a profitable sport. And then your projections will just get you even farther, throw out even more of these lineups, and make it so you have a better chance of winning. Subscribe to the channel to get updates for when I post a new video, and comment down below what topics you want me to address, and I'll try to make a video about them.